All right, we're going to be discussing skepticism more deeply in this lecture. Skepticism is a aspect of epistemology. Hopefully, you've read at least the first chapter on skepticism in the Feldman PDF that I sent. So, yeah, if you're starting this and you haven't yet, go ahead and read the bit on Descartes. Watch the first lecture and then read the Feldman and then watch this lecture. Or, I mean, you can read the Feldman after. The second chapter of the Feldman, we might discuss in another lecture, but it's more optional. All right. So skepticism. Do we actually know anything at all? And I love this Velociraptor meme. If I'm skeptical about skepticism, does that make me more or less of a skeptic? It's not entirely clear. All right, so what is skepticism? Skepticism in general is a philosophical position that says that we lack knowledge. Usually, this view is contrasted with a view that says that we do have some kind of knowledge, right? So skepticism comes in lots of different forms. It's rather widespread. There's lots of kinds of skepticism, and there's lots of skepticism in the world, I think. And some versions of skepticism are more plausible than others. Generally, the way that skepticism as a philosophical position works is we have people that are skeptics that construct arguments to show that we have less knowledge than we might otherwise think. It's generally taken, I think, sort of as the status quo standard that we do have certain kinds of knowledge. The skeptic, then, it seems like, is at least a little bit on the hook to try and show us why we don't have knowledge of the specific thing that they are skeptical about. Now, there's two sort of large-scale varieties of skepticism. I mean, there's really just, this is a good distinction. There's global skepticism, which is this like massive view that says, like, we don't have any knowledge at all, or we don't have any knowledge of the external world, like outside of us, or we don't really know anything about, most of what our existence or reality is. And then limited skepticism, where limited skepticism is much more nuanced and focused on specific areas, like, skepticism about vaccines is a limited form of skepticism. Skepticism about whether or not the world is round, whether or not, the coronavirus is a real pandemic. Those kinds of things are more limited. And I mean, there's more and less plausible ones there. But global skepticism is at the very least kind of the most interesting and absurd at the same time. Like, it's just, it's an out there kind of crazy view. But some people hold to it, and some people, I mean, at the very least, it seems like a kind of possible thing that could happen, right? That we are in a certain situation where we don't actually know anything, right? Like, we could be in a situation like in the Matrix, where, it turns out that we're stuck in a vat, and, the robots are just feeding us our experiences. So global skepticism is basically the view that we don't know anything. And it's sometimes accompanied with the view that knowledge itself is impossible. Global skepticism in general, I don't think, is terribly plausible as a view, though it is definitely possible. If you believe global skepticism is true, that's where, I mean, it's not terribly plausible. I mean, like, look at all the stuff that's around us. But that doesn't mean that we don't, we're able to rule out the possibility of skepticism itself, or that, that we are being globally deceived somehow. So limited kinds of skepticism, different kinds of skepticism, different areas. They range in plausibility, right? So scientists are skeptical about the existence of ghosts and spirits. That is a seemingly plausible kind of skepticism, right? People go out and try and look for ghosts and spirits all the time. And what do they come up with? A lot of very weird, scratchy footage or audio. And, I don't know if you've ever watched like Ghost Hunters or any of those shows. They're all sort of interesting, but I would definitely not call any of the, evidence that they come up with ever something along the lines of proof of the existence of ghosts or spirits. I mean, You know, you might take somebody's personal experience, but different forms of, like, another form of skepticism that some take to be, well, this is a more interesting one, would be like the existence of God, whether or not God exists, whether or not we can have knowledge of God, if he does exist, right? So some people think, we can't know whether or not God exists, so they're in a certain sense skeptical. Other people, I mean, like, I think we could know whether or not God exists if God decided to come down and say hello, right? Or if it's actually true that the Bible or some holy book is actually God-given. But that's another set of debates, right? There's another set of debates as to whether or not we have good reason for believing, that Jesus was the Son of God, or that, the Quran was in some way divinely inspired, or anything like that. Here's a meme. Skepticism within science is definitely there and real, right? It's a smaller kind of skepticism, though, generally. People are skeptical about whole theories, but skepticism in science is usually this, like, sort of smaller, built-on thing that, doesn't have huge complications or implications. It just means something like, oh, well, this theory over here is wrong, and that, I was skeptical of it from the get-go, or something like that. Whereas skepticism within philosophy is this sort of behemoth. It's this kind of monster that sits in the background of all discussions of epistemology, because of the very possibility of, things like global skepticism of the external world. It seems, and you'll see why, it really, really difficult to say that the skeptic is wrong, or to say that, there's something wrong with skepticism in general, and to articulate what reasons we actually have for believing that we have knowledge, or believing that we have knowledge, at the very least, of the external world around us. So now there's different levels of skeptical doubt that are worth taking into consideration, right? So here are the 3 levels. And this sort of divides skeptical views into 3 different kinds of views. The first being the strongest, right? So the strongest form of skepticism, and then we can remember, you can have limited skepticism about a specific subject matter, or you can have global skepticism about, like, everything, or the external world, at least. So the strongest form of skepticism says that knowledge itself is impossible. That is, that it's just not possible for some reason for someone to have knowledge of the external world, or of certain branch of science, or of ethics, or of mathematics. A slightly less strong version of skepticism is that no one is able to have knowledge, right? It doesn't say that knowledge is necessarily impossible, like that knowledge is something that just couldn't be had. It's that, like, maybe it's possible that somebody could have knowledge, but currently, the way that things are, nobody is in a position to actually have any knowledge, right? So here's an example. So knowledge is impossible would be like, nobody could ever have knowledge, nobody ever has had knowledge, nobody will ever have knowledge. Knowledge is saying that no one is currently able to have knowledge is different. It's saying, like imagine, so right now, probably no one is able to have knowledge of whether or not there are aliens on other planets. Like, why? Well, we have these conjectures. We think maybe there are aliens on other planets, like, life forms that have that are intelligent. Maybe there are some, but we haven't seen any. And we have some hypotheses that give us, like, maybe good reason to think that there probably are these intelligent life forms, but that doesn't rise to the level of us knowing that there are these intelligent life forms, right? And so currently, it seems like, given the evidence available to human beings, no one is able to have knowledge of, the fact, if it is a fact, that there are intelligent life forms on other planets somewhere, right? That's a little bit, it's weaker than saying that knowledge is impossible. It's not to say that knowledge is impossible. It's just to say that, no one's currently able to have knowledge of a certain sort. And finally, the last level of skeptical doubt you could have would just be to say something like, well, no one does have knowledge right now. Like, it's possible that somebody could have knowledge, but nobody's nothing's, at the current moment, nobody's like, put forth the work to know. And this would be like, sometimes this happens in science, right? So before Einstein's theory of relativity, nobody had knowledge that space and time were connected into this space-time thing, right? Now, after Einstein's theory comes out and Einstein sort of figured it out and then showed that it was accurate, we do have knowledge that to think that space and time are actually a unified kind of thing. Nobody did have that knowledge before, and then somebody came to have that knowledge and then spread it around, so people have that knowledge now. There's plausibly lots of things like that in science today, where currently, we can be skeptics in a certain sense that, nobody has knowledge of whether or not, everything is made up of strings at the subatomic level. But it could come to be that we do find out, somehow find out for sure. All right, epistemological skepticism. So there's some kinds of things that we can be skeptical about that have very little to do with epistemology, right? So like whether there's life on other planets, or whether or not mathematicians will ever be able to prove Goldbach's conjecture, which is just a specific kind of conjecture. I think it's the Goldbach's conjecture says that every prime number is the sum of two even numbers. I can't remember the sum of two. I can't remember the specifics, but yeah. So, take some mathematical conjecture that hasn't been proven yet. You might be skeptical and like, oh, well, nobody's ever going to actually be able to prove that thing because it's just going to take too much work, or it's too long or too hard, or maybe, it can't be proven because it's false. But these kinds of skepticism aren't really forms of what we might think of as epistemological skepticism. So think about like this. I mean, they're just kind of normal forms of skepticism. Epistemological skepticism is in for these big philosophical issues, right? So here's an example, and you might think about things this way, right? Suppose when it comes to studying ethics, you think something like, look, there's no ethical truths because ethics is just relative to culture and taste, right? You're a cultural relativist. And then you think, well, okay, so because there's no ethical truths, then it's not possible to have ethical knowledge. Why? Because if there's no ethical truths, then there's no ethical facts. And when we know things, we know what the facts are. And if there's just no facts about ethics, right, there's no facts about what's right or what's wrong, then we can't really have ethical knowledge. We can have recognition, like we can know the facts about other cultures' preferences and what they're going to think is ethical or unethical, but those things aren't really, ethical or unethical. They're just kind of their opinions, right? Well, so that would be a way of saying that there's no ethical truths, and then because of that, there's no ethical knowledge. But that's not epistemological skepticism, right? That's not to be skeptical of whether or not we can know anything in ethics. That's to say there's this kind of metaphysical view about ethical truths. That is, the nature of ethical truths consist in the facts about the culture and their preferences of the culture. And so really there just aren't any hard, solid ethical truths out there that we can know. Right, there aren't any real facts out there. Well, that's a different kind of story to tell than to tell a skeptical story about epistemological skepticism. An epistemological version of skepticism is going to say something about how it's impossible or really difficult in some way to know about some domain of facts that are already actually out there. Right. So the view of epistemological skepticism says, look, there is this domain of facts. So if we were going to be, skeptics about ethics, we'd have to say, look, there is this domain of facts. There really is what's right and what's wrong out there. And even though those facts are there, here are some reasons for thinking that we don't actually know anything about those facts. That would be an epistemological skeptical argument, right? You'd say like, oh, and then you'd explain why, right? Like, here's a reason for thinking it's too hard to know these facts, or that we haven't succeeded in knowing these facts yet, or maybe like that it's impossible in principle to know any of these facts. So here's some like better examples that are more along the lines of kinds of epistemological skepticism, right? these aren't like good examples, but like, the number of hairs on Jesus's head when he died is a case of something that, there was a fact of the matter, but it'd be really hard to know, and it's probably impossible. Nobody counted them back then, and nobody's going to count my hairs on my head now. But in a certain sense, it is kind of like possible to know. Other like better examples are things like whether there's an afterlife, right? Is it possible to know that there's an afterlife? Why think that we have good or bad evidence for believing that there is or isn't an afterlife, or believing that we shouldn't believe that we know anything about the afterlife? Another example is a good example is whether God exists, right? These are forms of epistemological skepticism where one can be skeptical of whether or not we have any knowledge about the case at all, right? So whether God exists is a question of metaphysics, right? Because either God exists or he doesn't. But whether or not we have any evidence, or whether or not we can know one way or another that God exists or that he doesn't, that's an epistemological issue. So I don't know if you've heard of the distinction between being a theist, an atheist, and an agnostic. The theist believes that God exists. The atheist believes that God does not exist. The agnostic takes the skeptical position and throws up his hands and says, hey, I don't know either way. It seems possible that God could exist, but I'd have no reason to believe that he does or doesn't, right? If he does exist, I need some evidence. If he doesn't exist, I guess I need some evidence there too, right? Until I've seen some good evidence one way or the other, I don't have any good reason to believe. All right, so there are a few arguments for skepticism. I'm going to go through, I think, 3. And before I get into the arguments, there's a few preliminaries that we need to cover. This is sort of, these are issues in logic. So this is, if you take a critical thinking class, you'll definitely cover this set of issues. So in logic, we have arguments. And an argument is basically a set of statements that have premises and a conclusion. So an argument is of a form like, usually of premise 1, premise 2, and then a conclusion, or something like that. They can be longer, but usually they're about that long. Now, if an argument is a good argument, then it's called a valid argument. And this is to distinguish, the way that people use the word valid in everyday speech. People say, oh, that's a valid point, where they basically just mean, oh, the point is like, on topic, or it sort of says the right thing for the moment. It gets to the point, right? Well, that's not what we mean here by valid. When I say valid, I mean something very specific. Validity is a property of arguments. So an argument, remember, set of statements that has a conclusion, where the first few statements are premises and they lead to the conclusion. An argument is a set of statements that's valid when a specific thing occurs. It's basically when the argument is airtight. Now, what is it for an argument to be airtight? An argument is valid when, if the premises are true, the conclusion necessarily follows, meaning the conclusion must also be true. Now, think about that. So suppose you have an argument that has 2 premises and a conclusion. That is, if the argument is valid, basically what I'm saying is that if both the first premise and the second premise are true, then it just has to be the case that the conclusion is true by the way that the thing is set up, by the way that the argument is set up, right? The setup is so that it follows first premise, second premise, conclusion. And you'll see how these work in a second, but that's basically, if the argument is valid, then these premises guarantee the conclusion, but that doesn't mean that the premises are true, right? It's possible still for the conclusion to be false, because it might be the case that one of the premises is false. All right, this means that if an argument is valid and you don't like the conclusion, you disagree with the conclusion, you can't just say, okay, the conclusion's false. What you have to do is find one of the premises that you think is false. Now, remember, what I said earlier is a valid argument, the premises and the conclusion are connected. The premises are such that if they're true, then the conclusion's got to be true also. So that means that if the conclusion is false, that if the argument itself is valid, then one of the premises has to be false too. So valid arguments can have false conclusions, but only if they rely on false premises. Here's a really simple, dumb example. Neil Armstrong, the first guy on the moon. If Neil Armstrong is a cow, then a cow has been in space, right? Okay, this is a weird sentence, but it's true, right? It's a true sentence. If Neil Armstrong is a cow, Neil Armstrong's been in space, so, you know, a cow's been in space. It's a weird sentence to say, but it's true. Premise 2, Neil Armstrong is a cow. Conclusion, so a cow has been in space. Now, this argument is valid. It's not true, though. It's not what's called sound. A sound argument is an argument that's valid and has true premises. This argument is unsound because it has a false premise. Premise 2, Neil Armstrong is not a cow, right? No matter how much he eats, he will never become a cow. Neil Armstrong is a human being. I actually don't remember. Maybe he passed away recently. I can't remember. All right, arguments for skepticism. Here is the first interesting argument for skepticism. This one comes from Descartes, from the reading that we did on Descartes. Premise 1, for any belief, if it could be mistaken, then it is not a case of knowledge. That is, any belief that you have, Descartes thinks, well, if it's something that I can doubt that can be false, then it can't be something that I know. Premise 2, all beliefs about blank could be mistaken. And now the thought is we take all of our beliefs about a particular subject matter, take the subject matter, fill it in the blank, and we say, oh, well, each of those could be mistaken, right? So take the external world, your external world beliefs, right? That you're like looking at your computer right now, listening to this YouTube video, take your beliefs about, you know, math or about ethics or anything, right? And stick them in there. All beliefs about, say, the external world could be mistaken, right? So for any, premise 1, for any belief, if it could be mistaken, then it's not a case of knowledge. Premise 2, all beliefs about the external world could be mistaken. Conclusion, therefore, all beliefs about the external world are not cases of knowledge. All right, that's how the argument goes. If you buy premise 1 and premise 2, filling in for the external world, for the blank, then the conclusion, where we've also filled in the external world, must follow. It can't be the case that both the premises are true and the conclusion is not true, right? If the premises are true, it's going to guarantee the truth of the conclusion. Now, question here is whether or not you buy it, right? So if either, here are your options. Either reject premise 1, reject premise 2, reject both of them, or accept the conclusion, right? If you think premise 1 is true and you think premise 2 is true, then you have to accept the conclusion. Now, there are versions of this, right? This argument that might be good if you accept premise 1, right? Suppose for any belief, if it could be mistaken, then it's not a case of knowledge, and all beliefs about, you know, the number of hairs on my head could be mistaken, right? That seems right because you never know at any given point. Suppose you count all the hairs on my head, but that's going to take a long time. And in between the time that you start counting and you finish counting, it's likely that I've lost a hair from my head, right? So for any belief, it could be mistaken. And all beliefs about the number of hairs on my head, it could be mistaken. Therefore, all beliefs about the number of hairs on my head are not cases of knowledge. That seems somewhat plausible. But I mean, in the end, though, if you take this all the way up to issues about like the external world or mathematical beliefs or beliefs about things that seem to be necessarily true, like in ethics, like that causing harm to people is a bad thing to do to them, that just seems a little bit strong, right? I mean, that's a pretty intense view to think that in the end, it's the case that just because we're mistaken sometimes about things, like just because it could be that we make a mistake, that somehow we never have any knowledge. But that's Descartes' view. That's one of the views that Descartes uses to try and firm up his foundationalism. All right. Another argument of Descartes, the certainty argument. This argument is rather straightforward. I use S and P here. S stands for a person, right? A student. And P stands for a proposition. Kind of think about it as like a sentence. Any sentence that you think is like any declarative sentence, you can stick in for P. So if S knows that P, then S is certain that P. No one is ever certain about blank. Therefore, for any P, it is not the case that S knows that P. Right? Here you fill in the blank with something that relates to P, right? But really, it doesn't actually matter here. The idea is just that when we're talking about the nature of knowledge, if a person knows something, the premise one there is, if a person knows something, then they must be certain of that thing, right? And then premise two says, no one is ever actually certain about whatever, right? So we can change the first premise to, if S knows about the external world, then S is certain about the external world. But no one is ever certain about the external world. Therefore, for any person, or for any thing about the external world, it's not the case that S knows that about the external world, right? That would be a version of this argument, the certainty argument. It basically connects having knowledge and being certain. Now, is this argument plausible? I mean, it sounds pretty good. If it does, I mean, it does seem kind of right sometimes to think if S knows that P, like, okay, so if I know that my car is in the parking lot, then I'm certain that my car is in the parking lot, right? It could be, I mean, yeah, right? If my car happened to not be in the parking lot, then I wouldn't know it, right? And it'd be because I'm not 100% certain. Somebody could have stolen my car. And so it does seem like, no one's ever really certain unless they're looking at their car, that like about where their car is. So it seems like, if you're not certain about it, then you don't know it. That sounds sort of right, right? Now, what about the external world, right? So if S knows that they are looking at a computer screen, listening to a YouTube video right now, then S is certain that she's looking at a computer screen, listening to a lecture right now. But no one is ever certain about whether or not they're looking at a computer screen and listening to a lecture right now, right? Why? Because, you might be in the Matrix. You might be a brain in a vat. Therefore, for any belief about whether or not one's looking at a computer screen, listening to a lecture, it's not the case that she knows that she's looking at a computer screen and listening to a lecture. All right, the certainty argument. Is the certainty argument good? We'll come back to this. I think that it's problematic. So if you were going to pick one premise, which premise do you think you'd pick to deny, right? And I think I think both premises 1 and 2 can be questioned, right? Sometimes there are certain things that you are certain about. And so if you're certain about those things, then you can know about those things. But the other premise, that if S knows that P, then S is certain that P, that seems a little strong. Just because you know something doesn't mean you have to be certain about it, right? It seems like if you're certain about something, then you definitely know it. But the other way around, not necessarily. It seems like, certainty, the things you're certain about are smaller than the things that you know. You know things sometimes that you're not certain about. All right. Argument that I sort of started going over last week, and here's a more sort of fleshed out version of it. The brain in the vat argument. Take the brain in the vat hypothesis. Take this statement. You could, right now, be a handless brain in a vat. hooked up to a computer through electrodes that stimulate you in a way that make your experience seem exactly like it is right now. Now take this other obvious belief. I have hands. You have hands. Raise your hands up. Look at them. Think to yourself, I have hands. Now, here's the argument. Premise one. No one knows that the brain in the vat hypothesis is false, right? No one knows that it's false that you could be a handless brain in a vat hooked up to a computer through electrodes that stimulate you right now to make your experiences seem exactly the way that they do right now, right? No one knows that it's false, because if it was false, or I mean, if you are hooked up to it, then it's going to seem exactly the same right now, right? So no one knows that they're not a brain in a vat, right? No one knows for themselves, for their own case, that one is false. All right, premise two, or sub-conclusion really. So S doesn't know that brain in a vat is false, right? So from one, you get to two, where you put some person in for S. Premise three, if S knows that OB is true, then S knows that the brain in a vat hypothesis is false. Now, OB says that you have hands. It's the obvious truth, right? If S knows that S has hands is true, then S knows that S is not a brain in a vat, right? Because if S knows that S has hands, then S knows that S is not a handless brain in a vat hooked up to electrodes. So, problem, if no one knows that they're not a brain in a vat, and then S surely doesn't know. So if S doesn't know, then it seems like we end up with conclusion 4 here. S doesn't know that OB is true. S doesn't know that S has hands. Wow, that seems pretty crazy, right? This form of argument is called modus tollens. It's the form of argument. You've got a conditional statement here. If P, then Q, and then you say not Q, right? So premise 2 denies the second half of premise 3. And if basically, if you've got the denial of the second half of a conditional statement, of an if-then statement, then you know that you can deny also as a conclusion the first half of the conditional statement. So if this argument works, it shows that S doesn't know that S has hands on the basis of the fact that S doesn't know that S is not a brain in a vat. All right, is this argument plausible? Oh, I don't think so, right? I mean, I feel like I know that I have hands. So what premise do I have to deny? Is it really the case that if premise 3 is a long and complicated premise, but I'm pretty sure it's true, right? Because it seems like if you know that you have hands, then you know that you're not a handless brain in a vat, right? Now, it's always possible that you're that you are just a body that's hooked up and your brain is being stimulated. So you still do have hands in that situation. But we can fix that by just imagine the brain in a vat hypothesis. We've got a bodiless brain in a vat, right? And so that's what we're thinking about, whether or not. And so if you know that you have hands, then you know that you're not just a brain that's in a vat hooked up, right? Because that brain can't know that it has hands, because it doesn't. It might seem like it has hands to that brain. The brain might, be experiencing hand-like signals going to it, hand-like perceptual states going to it, being generated by the computer, but it definitely doesn't have hands, and so it can't know that it has hands. You can't know things that are false. So 3 seems safe to me. But what about 1 and 2 here, right? I mean, I'm not 100% on those. Is it really the case that no one knows that the brain in the vat hypothesis is false? I don't know. I mean, it's really, really difficult to think that you know. Do you think that you actually know that you are currently not in a matrix-like scenario? Are you able to tell? Could you tell? Can you tell if they were exactly the same, if they felt exactly the same and they seemed exactly the same? Like, imagine there's just a really, really good futuristic computer program that is running our brains and making everything feel exactly like it does feel. It just doesn't. I have no idea how it would be possible to know that the brain in the vat hypothesis is false. So I don't know. It looks really tough. Maybe we're stuck with this argument. All right. Responses to skepticism. There's three sort of main, pretty good responses to skepticism that I think are interesting and worth discussing here. The main responses are that skepticism is self-undermining, what we call the Moore's response, where we talk about hands a lot, and fallibilism. So supposing skepticism is self-undermining is a pretty easy thing to do. Now, and you might think about this. This gets us back to the Velociraptor meme at the beginning. The skeptic claims to know that nothing can be known, right? Especially the global skeptic. The global skeptic says nothing about the external world can be known, or that knowledge is impossible. And they seem to think that they know that. But how could they possibly know that, right? I mean, they're saying nothing can be known, and then they're claiming that they know that nothing can be known. Isn't that self-defeating? Like, suppose that a skeptic says, no one can know anything about the external world. Well, wait a minute. Isn't knowing that no one can know anything about the external world a way of knowing something about the external world? It seems like they've got themselves stuck in this pickle, right? So how can the skeptic possibly get out of this pickle? Well, there's two options. And skeptics that are serious go one of these two ways. Either the skeptic retreats to agnosticism, and they say, well, really, I don't know that no one can know anything. I don't know that. But, nobody's given me a good argument one way or the other, right? So it's like similar to agnosticism about the existence of God. The other way that skeptics go, and I think this maybe is a little bit more plausible, is that they hedge their skepticism. They say stuff like this. They say, look, I'm not trying to be skeptical from my own position. I'm just trying to show you that given your position, the way that you believer in the external world believe things, that you are committed to not being able to know things, right? So what the skeptic will do is say, look, I'm going to take on your position. Your position is that, you are experiencing the external world, and then I'm going to show you on the basis of some arguments, like the fact that you're never certain about things, or that you don't know that you're not a brain in a vat, or that you don't know that you're not not everything is certain things that you believe are possible, like they could be false. Because of those things, from your position, you believer in knowledge, you are stuck in a position where you've got to come over to my side, to the skepticism side. And so what they do is they hedge their skepticism. They say stuff like, so if it really is the case that we are experiencing the external world in this way, then it's not possible for us to actually know anything about the external world, because we can't know that we're not brains and vats, or because we can't know with certainty. So the skeptic can kind of get out of the self-undermining worry, but they do have to change their view just a little bit. They can't come out guns blazing and have as strong a view as you might think. But they are able to retreat from this response a little bit. All right, what about Moore's response? So Moore responds to skepticism in a rather interesting way. So remember, basically back to the brain in the vat argument. And here's kind of Moore's response to external world skepticism. So there's a famous story about Moore actually getting up in front of a whole room full of people claiming that he was going to prove that external world skepticism was false once and for all, right? And he's like, he's this interesting philosopher that helped start what's called analytic philosophy at the turn of the 1800s to 1900s. He gets up in front of this room and he goes to the podium and he says, "This is a hand. This is another hand. Therefore, two external world objects exist." Right? And so basically what he's saying there is, look, this is something that is a hand, and I know that it's a hand, and I'm confident that it's a hand. And if this is a hand, and I do know that this is a hand, then the external world exists, right? And skepticism is false. So, the external world does exist, and skepticism is false, right? Basically, I mean, this is not terribly super persuasive, right? But Moore, basically what Moore is saying and what he's kind of thinking is something like this. Look, the statement, "this is a hand," while I'm looking at my hand, is way more plausible than the brain in the vat hypothesis, right? It's way more plausible than the skeptical hypothesis that really, someone's deceiving me, or really, I just, I don't actually know that I'm not currently in the matrix. It's way more plausible to believe, right? It's just, I'm so much more certain, in a sense, that this is a hand, that the hands that in front of me are a hand. And I'm not so certain that, I don't know that I'm not a brain in a vat. Now, this is a little bit unsatisfying. It doesn't answer the skeptic in a sense directly, but it pushes them and it rejects sort of their starting point in favor of Moore's own, right? The skeptic tries to say, look, you don't know you're not a brain in a vat. And then they try to say why, right? They give you this song and dance about how things are like, look, it would seem the same if you were in this other situation, right? If you were hooked up to electrodes and you were a brain in a vat, it would seem just like it seems now for you, right? Moore rejects that position, right? He doesn't give the skeptics an inch. He says, yeah, okay, I mean, maybe, right? Like that's the way to confront the skeptic in this case, right? Is be like, if someone gives you a skeptical scenario and then they give you some like outlandish possibility that, could be the case, and that's what they're trying to rest their argument on, then you should look at them with an incredulous stare. You should be like, what? Right? If their argument ends up getting you, like, trying to get you to believe that you can't even know that you have hands, then their argument has got to be bonkers, right? So what Moore does is he flips the argument the other way. And what he basically does is this. He says, well, no, look, I'm really, really sure that these are my hands. And if I'm really sure these are my hands and that shows that your argument is wrong, then I'm just going to take that these are my hands as evidence that your argument is wrong. And so that's what he does. It's an interesting position, and it's sort of a good way, I think, to confront skeptics, right? So if you ever confront somebody that's like, I don't know, an anti-vaxxer that believes that, big pharma is out to get us, well, ask them, like, why they believe that and what like implausible conspiracy theory they're feeding, themselves in order to believe that sort of thing. Because those are the kinds of things, those, it seems, much more plausible that, I mean, sure, some pharmaceutical companies are in it just to make money, but it seems like, that very, very rarely are pharmaceutical companies in it to harm people. All right. Yeah. So if someone ever asks you, poses to you a skeptical scenario, ask them why it's plausible to believe their claims, right? Ask them for their reason, and then see if those reasons also apply to, this is a hand, right? If the skeptic, see what, plausible sounding thing you believe that the skeptic is trying to get you to deny, and then ask whether their reasons for believing what they are trying to tell you to believe also apply to the case of the plausible thing that you think you already believe. Our last response is fallibilism. And this, I think, people used to be infallibilists. That is, people used to think that in order to know things, you had to be certain. But fallibilism is the view that it's possible to know things, even if those things could be false, right? You could be wrong, you could be mistaken. So here's the idea. I know right now that my car is in the parking lot, but I'm not certain that my car is in the parking lot. Why? Well, I parked it there a few hours ago, but I haven't gone and checked on it. It's totally possible that somebody stole it or it got towed. I mean, it's unlikely, but it's possible. So I'm not certain that my car is in the parking lot. But I do know that my car is in the parking lot, right? And my car is still there. And, you know, even though it's possible that my car could get towed or get broken into and stolen, that doesn't mean that I don't currently know that my car is in the parking lot, given that my car is actually still in the parking lot, right? The mere possibility of its getting stolen doesn't somehow preclude me from having knowledge. And so it seems like if certainty requires that we really, you know that we know, or have some really, really like strong form of knowledge, then it just doesn't seem like, in order to know in a kind of weaker sense, that we have to be certain. So is it really the case that your belief isn't knowledge if it is possible that the belief could be doubted, or if it's possible that the belief could be false? It doesn't seem so, right? Just because something could be false doesn't mean that it is false. If you believe something but you aren't certain, it seems like it still could be true, and you could still have a good reason for believing it. And so in that case, you probably still know it. This also causes, the problem of certainty causes an epistemic regress, and I think we have good reason to reject that we need to be certain in order to know anyway. So think about this. In order to be certain that you know something, so take a really simple example, like hold up a pen in front of you. I've got a red pen before me. I know that the cap of this pen is red. Now, am I certain that the cap of this pen is red? Well, in order to be certain that the cap of this pen is red, it seems like I have to know that I know that the cap of this pen is red. Okay, great. So do I know that the cap of this red pen is red? I would hope so. But wait, if I'm going to know that thing, I need to be certain of it. So now I need to know that I know that the cap of this red pen is red. Do I know that I know that the cap of this red pen is red? Oh, I don't know, right? In order to know that, I have to be certain. And if I have to be certain, then I have to know that I know that I know that I know that the cap of this red pen is red. I mean, like, that's crazy. Like, when is it going to stop? When is it going to stop? I'm going to have to keep asking whether or not I'm certain. And in order to be certain, I'm going to have to ask whether or not I know that I know that I know that I know, etc. Right? This regress gives us a reason for thinking, well, wait, no, there's got to be some stopping point. Maybe you do have to know that you know in order to be certain, but you don't have to know that you know every single time. You don't have to be certain always. You don't have to always be certain about everything in order to know something in the first place. All right, wrapping up. Skepticism is still around as a philosophical position, but not a whole lot of philosophers take it seriously. It kind of acts these days in epistemology as a really interesting test case, especially global skepticism. Pretty much always global skepticism about the external world. It's a really good test case for showing the limits of the things that we can and can't know. It allows us to test our arguments for the things that we believe and come up with interesting and clever ways, like thinking like, oh, this is a hand, right? To argue for and against certain kinds of things. It also kind of helps us to see that some people just can't be helped, right? What do I mean by that? Well, sometimes you come across people that just want to argue with you. And sometimes it comes to be really difficult to see how you can argue against those people. And one of the interesting things I think that thinking about and learning about skepticism allows us to actually know is that sometimes those people don't have to be debated on their own grounds. The skeptic assumes that you can't know that you're not a brain in a vat. That seems plausible, but it turns out that if you don't know you're not a brain in a vat, then you don't know jack squat about the external world. That seems terrifying. So, it's like you give them an inch and they take a lot more. So don't give them an inch in the first place, right? Stick to your guns. You don't have to always give in and debate someone on their own grounds. You can start from your own starting places. And philosophically, we can debate what the best starting places actually are to be in. But I mean, for the most part, everybody agrees the skeptic's starting place is an extreme starting place. They hold to a way too high of a standard for knowledge. On their view, like animals don't have knowledge, babies don't have knowledge, the smartest person in the world doesn't have knowledge. Maybe even like God or super aliens don't have knowledge, whoever those are, if they are out there. And that just seems crazy. Like we built the pyramids way back when. We built giant skyscrapers today. We've gone to the moon. We have to know stuff, right? I mean, unless global skepticism really is true and all of that stuff is just a lie. One of the sort of, Bertrand Russell had a really interesting point for thinking about these kinds of things, right? It could be the case that the universe was started 5 minutes ago and you wouldn't know it, right? Because the universe was started and everything, it just started just like how it is now, but 5 minutes ago, right? Like it just started kind of in the middle with you already having all your memories and stuff. Like you couldn't know that wasn't the case. You can't know that that's not the case. But that doesn't mean that you have to give that as your starting place to people. If from there they're going to argue to the fact that you don't have hands, right? All right, I hope you enjoyed that romp through skepticism, and we'll be talking a little bit more maybe about that and start talking about the structure of knowledge and justification in the next lecture.